In the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Asterix X asks us, do suppressed memories actually exist? Before we get into that, a quick message from our sponsor Skillshare. How many times have I mentioned Skillshare on this channel? It's many, and I know many of you guys have gone to check it out with a free trial, but some of you might not have done that yet, and it is well worth doing. They have tens of thousands of classes on Skillshare, enabling you to level up everything from your design, business, video, social media, really whatever skills you can imagine, you can do it on Skillshare. Or even if you're a total beginner and you're not looking to level up, you're looking to kind of get started from the very beginning, they've got courses from beginner to expert, so it's a good place for you. Now, I've taken video production courses. You've heard me talk about those before. I also took a productivity course from a chap called Thomas Frank, who's also a YouTuber, on just getting more stuff done in a day. It's great stuff. I'm a pretty productive person, and I still found it to be really useful. Worth checking out if you'd like to get more done in a day without feeling all stressed out. But yes, Skillshare, just go do it. You'll like it. It's also free for 2 months, so if you don't, not a big deal. And then after that, it's just $10 a month if you want to continue. Support today, I found out, by supporting Skillshare. It's a good thing to do. Link below, 2-month free trial. And let's get into it. We've all seen it in movies. A character will be going along in their lives blissfully unaware of some extremely traumatic event in their long-distant past. That is, until a bit of syrup dribbles onto their cheek and they're transported back in their mind to that time they were abducted by aliens. Suddenly they remember everything. But, well, do such repressed memories actually exist? It turns out that while only a few decades ago the idea of repressed memories was an extremely popular notion among psychologists, including many a person being thrown into prison when someone would randomly recover such a traumatic memory from their childhood after undergoing psychotherapy to retrieve it, the issue is a bit more controversial today. According to a study conducted at the University of California, Irvine, published in the Journal of the Association of Psychological Science in 2013, approximately 60 to 90% of psychologists, varying based on therapist type, who are clinicians, still believe that repressed memories exist in some cases, though generally they are considered to be rare. Further, 43 to 75% think these repressed memories can be retrieved with proper methods. In stark contrast, approximately 70% of research psychologists believe there is no such thing as repressed memories. So, well, what's going on here? To begin with, on the research psychologist side, their stance is largely backed by the fact that, as noted by famed psychologist Chris French of the University of London, there is no convincing evidence to support the existence of the psychoanalytic concept of repression, despite it being a widely accepted concept. Despite this, many clinicians still believe it is. As to why, Lawrence Patterhis of the aforementioned study illustrating the divide between clinicians and researchers speculates clinicians are more apt to trust clinical experience, while researchers tend to trust experimental research. There are many anecdotal reports of cures coming from retrieving repressed memories, but at the same time, credible experimental evidence of it does not exist. Further stacking the evidence on the side of the researchers, it turns out that traumatic events that induce a strong emotional response, which are so often the subject of supposed repressed memories, tend to be the ones we remember the best. That said, traumatic events can and often are ultimately forgotten, particularly when said events don't actually induce a significant emotional response. For instance, a child might experience something that would normally be called traumatic but doesn't realize it's a traumatic event, so doesn't associate a strong emotional response with it. These tend to be forgotten at much higher rates, similar to what you'd expect from any given memory. In fact, in one study, Recall of Childhood Trauma, a prospective study of women's memories of child sexual abuse published in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, it's noted that 38% of the adults studied who had a high probability of being abused as children based on documented evidence had forgotten about it as adults. In one case, one of the participants, who was adamant she had never been sexually abused, was asked a follow-up question if she knew anyone that had been in trouble for his or her sexual behavior. Eventually, the woman did remember that her uncle had. She stated, "I never met my uncle. He died before I was born. You see, he molested a little boy. When the little boy's mother found out the son was molested, she took a butcher knife and stabbed my uncle in the heart, killing him." In fact, that is exactly what had happened, except in this case the woman being interviewed was one of the children the uncle had allegedly done this to, resulting in the mother of one of the children murdering him with a knife. The now adult woman in the study had only been 4 years old at the time, a time when few remember anything of their lives, traumatic or not. Similarly, in a case reported by the Recovered Memory Project, a woman named Claudia was involved in a group therapy session to help with weight loss when, for whatever reason, she began remembering being sexually abused by her older brother when she was little. Her brother had died in Vietnam approximately 15 years before, and their parents had essentially left his room and belongings alone. When she returned home, Claudia searched the room and found not only a set of handcuffs in his closet, but a diary in which he supposedly recorded his, to quote, sexual experiments with his sister. From many such cases as these, as should come as no surprise to anyone, humans tend to forget things all the time, and later, sometimes they remember them. It's just that studies to date don't really demonstrate that the brain is actively repressing these memories, as is so widely believed among the general public and, to a lesser extent, clinical psychologists. While this might otherwise be a mundane issue only worth psychologists arguing over, it turns out it's actually a pretty pernicious one thanks to the way clinicians classically tried to recover these memories, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s when the idea of recovering repressed memories was en vogue. This was often done in cases where forgotten traumatic events were thought by therapists as the causes of things like depression and anxiety in a given client. It turns out many of the methods used by psychologists came to be discovered as textbook ways to get people to create false memories. To begin with, to illustrate how easy it is to plant a false memory, in one early study, now famed memory researcher Dr. Elizabeth Loftus and co. decided to see if they could implant a false memory into people of having been lost at a shopping mall when they were 5 years old. Their method here, as explained by Dr. Loftus, was: we prepared a booklet for each participant containing one-paragraph stories about 3 events that had actually happened to him or her and 1 that had not. We constructed the false event using information about a plausible shopping trip provided by a relative, who also verified that the participant had not, in fact, been lost at about the age of 5. The lost in the mall scenario included the following elements: lost for an extended period, crying, aid and comfort by an elderly woman, and finally, reunion with the family. What they ultimately found was, after asking people to recall the events with as much detail as possible, a question many a clinical psychologist would ask among other methods, almost 1/3 of the people involved remembered this experience. In yet another similar study at Western Washington University, parents of students reported various events that had happened to their children. The researchers then asked the students if they could give their version of the story to illustrate how people remember things differently. They also planted a false story within these real ones about either being hospitalized as a child or having had a birthday party with a clown and pizza at the age of 5. It was also confirmed with the parents that neither of those things ever happened. Illustrating the power of suggestion, not a single student remembered the false event the first time they were interviewed about it. Yet, in a second interview, 1/5 of them remembered it after thinking about it for a while. Some even eventually remembered the event in incredible detail, including specific people visiting them in the hospital. In yet another study by the same research group, this time they went with the subjects having to evacuate a store as a child when the sprinkler system went off, drenching everyone, or having spilled a giant bowl of punch at a wedding directly on the parents of the bride. Once again, nobody remembered the false memory the first time, but the second time, almost 1/5 did, including, again, with some remembering remarkably vivid and small details. Going yet more traumatic and somewhat controversial, there have been studies where researchers implanted false memories of everything from people almost drowning as children to being demon-possessed, all with similar results. Of course, in many of these cases, the idea was fed to the subjects, and some of them then created the detailed false memories based on that suggestion. So, how do these correlate to methods used by clinical psychologists in the late 20th century and, to a lesser extent, now? As one example, we have imagination therapy, where patients are asked to imagine an often traumatic event and not worry about whether it happened or not, a once very popular method for trying to draw out repressed or forgotten memories. For example, as famed sex therapist Wendy Mattles once stated, she would tell her patients to spend time imagining you were sexually abused without worrying about accuracy proving anything or having your ideas make sense. Ask yourself these questions. What time of day is it? Where are you? Indoors or outdoors? What kind of things are happening? Is there one or more person with you? Who would have been likely perpetrators? When were you most vulnerable to sexual abuse in your life? In studies looking at whether this type of imagination therapy increases the likelihood of implanting a false memory, one study's subjects were asked a series of questions about a made-up event of running toward a window as a child, then tripping and breaking the window with their hands as they fell. It turns out that the act of imagining that it happened increased about 1 in 4 of the participants' confidence that the event had actually happened, versus only about 1 in 10 reporting an increase in confidence when not asked to imagine the event had occurred. Other studies have shown that the more frequently subjects were made to imagine a made-up event, the more and more likely they are to later state that the event actually happened. In yet another study using these type of guided methods as well as hypnosis, participants were made to supposedly recover memories from directly after they were first born. Of course, the researchers at Carleton University actually simply implanted specific memories. Incredibly, 95% of people being studied using guided mnemonic restructuring came to remember some memories from directly after birth. And on the other hand, 70% who were subjected to hypnosis also recovered these so-called impossible memories. Also important to note is that about half of the groups also remembered the specific memory from shortly after being born that the researchers had completely made up. Dr. Loftus states of all of this, "Research is beginning to give us an understanding of how false memories of complete emotional and self-participatory experiences are created in adults. First, there are social demands on individuals to remember. For instance, researchers exert some pressure on participants in a study to come up with memories. Second, memory construction by imagining events can be explicitly encouraged when people are having trouble remembering. And finally, individuals can be encouraged not to think about whether their constructions are real or not. Creation of false memories is most likely to occur when these external factors are present, whether in an experimental setting, in a therapeutic setting, or during everyday activities." This, very unfortunately, resulted in cases like Nadine Cool. In 1986, she went to see a psychiatrist who in turn used a variety of popular techniques, including hypnosis, to try to see if she had any repressed memories about being abused as a child. In the end, what surfaced were memories of being raped, being forced into bestiality, eating babies, watching her friend get murdered, being forced to be involved in a satanic cult, etc. At one point, the psychiatrist in question even decided she had at least 120 distinct personalities, one of which was somehow that of a duck. And then, apparently, because this wasn't bizarre enough, she had an exorcism performed on her body to get Satan out. Of course, after years of this, it ultimately became clear none of these things had actually happened to her, and they were simply false memories inadvertently implanted by her psychiatrist over time using these various methods. In another famous case, one Beth Rutherford's therapists used similar methods to try and recover repressed memories in 1992, only to have her vividly remember her mother holding her down while her father, a minister, raped her countless times over the course of 7 years, starting when she was only 7 years old. This included twice getting her pregnant and then painfully aborting the pregnancies using a coat hanger. Naturally, the whole thing ruined her father's career and reputation, among other devastating effects on all involved. But it turns out none of that actually happened, which Beth ultimately discovered, among other evidence, when she went in for an examination, and it turns out that not only was it very clear she'd never been pregnant, but it was also of the opinion of her doctors that she was clearly still a virgin. Naturally, in both the cases of Beth and Nadine, neither were too pleased at having been put through all of that mental trauma, plus having put others they loved through similar stress and hardship when it was eventually demonstrated that none of the recovered memories had ever happened. Perhaps the most famous case of all of these was of Aileen Franklin, who would later go on to author a book called Sins of the Father, documenting the saga as she saw it. In her case, when she was a child, one of her friends, 8-year-old Susan Nason, was raped and murdered. Nason's body was discovered 2 months later, but the killer was never identified. That is, until Aileen was an adult, and her own daughter allegedly turned to look at her one day and reminded her so much of her friends that suddenly she remembered witnessing her own father, George Franklin, raping and murdering Nason right in front of her. Soon enough, Franklin was arrested, tried, and convicted, despite there not being any real evidence other than this recovered memory. Finally, 6 years after being imprisoned, the ruling was overturned by a federal appeals court who, among other things, noted that the prosecutor's entire case depended on the accuracy of repressed memories which were unreliable. In this case, they were taken as absolute fact, despite the lack of corroborating evidence. The appeals court also criticized the judge involved for not allowing the defense to introduce evidence that all of the pertinent facts of the case Aileen supposedly remembered had actually appeared in news accounts of the crime which Aileen was privy to. This was particularly important as much of the confidence that Aileen's memories were real came from the fact that many of the details she recalled did indeed match up with the evidence of the case. Not long after, Franklin was released after 6 years in prison. Prosecutors were initially going to forge ahead and attempt to get Franklin thrown back behind bars, but then a few pertinent pieces of information came out that resulted in them moving to dismiss the charges. First, Aileen had alleged that she had recovered another memory of her father raping and murdering someone else, this time an 18-year-old woman whose murder at that point was also unsolved. However, when a DNA test was done on the semen recovered, it didn't match George Franklin's DNA. Further, minutes from a meeting at his work at the time of this particular particular murder showed that Franklin had indeed been at the fire station where he worked at that time. Thus, unless he had discovered a way to be in two places at once, well, he couldn't have done it. The nail in the coffin on the original case was when Aileen's sister Janice told the prosecutors that Aileen allegedly told her that she had remembered the events of the case in question while being hypnotized, contrary to what Aileen and Janice had stated during the trial. If true, this made those memories unreliable in the eyes of the court, thanks to a Supreme Court ruling on a similar case, and thus the prosecution finally decided to have the charges dismissed. Aileen, however, at this point firmly maintained she remembered these things happening and was still convinced her father was guilty of this and other alleged crimes from later recovered memories that she had of him raping her as well. But as the aforementioned psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who was called to testify in this particular case, noted during the whole ordeal, I have little doubt that Aileen Franklin believes with every cell of her being that her father murdered Susan Nason. But I believe there is a very real possibility that the whole concoction was spun not from solid facts, but from vaporous breezes of wishes, dreams, fears, desires. Aileen's mind, operating independently of reality, went about its business of collecting ambiguities and inconsistencies and wrapping them up into a sensible package, revealing to her in one blinding moment of insight a coherent picture of the past that was nevertheless completely and utterly false. Aileen's story is her truth, but I believe it is a truth that never happened. Illustrating the potential scope of the problem of false memories in court cases, Dr. Loftus would later state in a TED Talk, in one project in the United States, information has been gathered on 300 innocent people, 300 defendants who were convicted of crimes they didn't do. They spent 10, 20, 30 years in prison for these crimes, and now DNA testing has proven that they are actually innocent. And when those cases have been analyzed, 3/4 of them are due to faulty eyewitness memory. Of course, moving back to recovered memories, there really are people who were abused or witnessed or endured traumatic things as children and then later completely forgot about it. So few are willing to reject the memories of everyone who has such recollections later in life, even when recovered through therapy. It's just that, as Dr. Loftus states, the one take-home message is this: just because someone tells you something with a lot of detail and emotion, it doesn't mean it actually happened. You need independent corroboration to know whether you're dealing with an authentic memory or something that is a product of some other process. She goes on, many people believe that memory works like a recording device. You just record the information, then you call it up and play it back when you want to answer questions or identify images. But decades of work in psychology has shown that this just isn't true. Our memories are constructive. They're reconstructive. Memory works a little bit more like a Wikipedia page. You can go in there and change it. But so can other people. So to sum up, while some psychologists still think repressed memories are a thing, there really isn't presently much data backing up the notion versus the simpler explanation that people have just simply forgotten things, like they forget most of what happens in their lives. Further, given that it's absurdly easy to get people to remember things, even of the extremely traumatic variety that never actually happened, trying to distinguish between real and false memories is something of an effort in futility without outside hard evidence. In the end, it turns out that human memory is incredibly fallible, but few of us want to accept that, so much of what we remember in life didn't quite happen, or in some cases, happen like we remember it. This, unfortunately, occasionally leads to people being convicted of sometimes even extreme crimes that they never actually committed. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, subscribe, smash that bell so you find out when we put out a new video. Also, support this show by supporting our wonderful sponsor Skillshare. There is a link to them below. And as always, thank you for watching.